It gladdens me to know that Odin prepares for a feast. This hero that comes into Valhalla does not lament his death. I shall not enter Odin's hall with fear. My death comes without apology, and I welcome the Valkyries to summon me home.
The Viking Advance.
Chapter 4.
Beside the brooding forested slopes of Trondheim Fjord, in the year 998, King Olaf Tryggvason ordered the construction of what he intended to be the best and most costly ship ever made in Norway. She was called the Long Serpent, and the name was aptly chosen. This, the greatest of dragon ships, was to stretch more than 160 feet from her curved, monster-headed prow to her identically curved and serpentine tail. She was designed to carry 34 oars on each side, and she could transport hundreds of Vikings into battle. The bow and the stern were to be elaborately carved and gilded, the sails to be richly dyed, and brightly painted shields would hang on either side. Vast oak forests then covered much of southern Norway, but King Olaf's men had to search far and wide to find a tree tall and straight enough to provide the trunk that would become the massive 145-foot keel of this awesome ship. It took a small army of Viking shipwrights to procure the materials, splitting well-seasoned logs so that each plank was grained for maximum strength, searching out naturally formed oak and spruce elbows and arches for the ship's ribs and struts, turning spruce roots into tough, naturally fibrous ropes to bind the shell and frame together, fashioning iron rivets and nails, wooden pegs or tree nails, and walrus hide thongs. With all in readiness, construction began on the hull, starting from the great keel up. The task of carving the beautifully curved stem post and stern post was entrusted to a skilled prowwright called Thorberg. Once these were in place, the planks would be added, each one placed above the last. But before the planking process got underway, Thorberg was called back to his farm on urgent personal business. When he returned to the shipbuilding weeks later, he saw that the planking had been completed, and to his dismay, he discovered that the journeyman carpenters, awed by the great dragon ship's size, had planked her with boards so thick that the ship would be much too heavy and ungainly in the water. The whole project would be a disaster. King Olaf, unaware of this crucial flaw, was admiring the sleek, towering lines of the huge warship as she stood in the stocks, and everybody said that never was seen so large and so beautiful a ship of war. Thorberg said not a word. The next morning, the king came to take another look at his masterpiece and fell into one of the flaming rages for which he was so well known. During the night, someone had gone up and down one side of the ship, cutting deep notches in all of the planks. The masterpiece was ruined. The king then bellowed in rage, "The man shall die who thus destroyed the vessel out of envy, and I shall bestow a great reward on whoever finds him out." Then spoke Thorberg the prowwright. "I will tell you, king, who did it. I did it myself." "You must restore it," swore the king, "to the same condition as before, or your life shall pay for it." As the king stormed off, Thorberg picked up his axe and began chipping away at all the thick planks. He trimmed them down till their surfaces were even with the deepest of his notches. When King Olaf and his men came back and examined the shaved side of the ship, they were amazed and delighted. As both Thorberg and Olaf well knew, the first principle of Viking ship construction was lightness and flexibility. The thinner the planks, the lighter the craft. The lighter she was, the less water she would draw, so she could maneuver in shallower waters, where heavier craft would most certainly run aground. Thinner planking also meant that the craft's sides would be built higher, so that she could ride above taller seas, and so that Viking warriors aboard could hurl their spears down upon lower, more vulnerable vessels. There were other advantages to thin planking. With a light but sturdy shell, a Viking ship could flex in the ocean waves like a slim leaf. The keel could bend up and down by as much as an inch, and the gunwales could twist as much as 6 inches out of true, without doing any damage to the ship. This would enable the hull to bend to the waves and slip through them with the least amount of resistance, making the ship faster and more stable. In the most favorable wind, a typical Viking vessel could achieve speeds of well over 10 knots, and clearly the Long Serpent could do even better. For a man like King Olaf, who had led war bands most of his days, these were matters of life or death. He recognized the genius of Thorberg's alterations and ordered the prowright to trim down the other side of the ship as well. He then appointed him master builder for the entire project. Ever afterward, Thorberg proudly bore the nickname Skafhog, or Smoothing Stroke, and the mighty Long Serpent became the most famous dragon ship of them all. A terror to the outside world, the Viking longships, the biggest among them called dragons, were a source of great and understandable pride to a Norseman. At a time in the Dark Ages, when the majority of men and women in the West lived and died within walking distance of their birthplaces, when travel was slow and dangerous, Vikings seemed to skitter over the map like water birds over a pond, appearing when they were least expected, disappearing when they chose. They could do this because, unlike the peoples of Europe in the early Middle Ages, they understood the sea and the power that mastery of the sea could give. Out of their primordial fjords and silent forests, endless waterways and wave-swept islands, they were born to the sea, and were soon sea-born, amphibious by nature and destined to become the quintessential seafarers of the age. Observed one early medieval chronicler, the Danes lived in the sea. It was scarcely an exaggeration, and it applied to the Swedes and the Norwegians as well. Long before they developed ships that were capable of traversing oceans, the Scandinavians depended upon the sea for food, fishing for cod, haddock, whiting, sardine, herring, tuna, and mackerel. They ventured out farther from shore in their dugouts and skin boats and wooden craft of strange new shapes. And eventually domination of the sea was theirs because of sheer excellence of their ship designs, and because of their ingenuity in devising unusual navigational methods. The earliest Norse ships appear in rock carvings dating from around 1500 BC. The familiar high curved stem and stern of the Scandinavian double-enders are clearly evident in these carvings, the inevitable result of the Vikings having to negotiate with the violent seas of the north. This form of double-ender, which was a uniquely Scandinavian design, permitted smooth handling of the ship even with mountainous following sea, because the wave force was divided by the stern as easily as it was by the bow, and the stern then lifted, keeping the craft from being pooped and possibly overwhelmed. Although some of the earliest Bronze Age boats in the northernmost parts of Scandinavia were sewn together from skins stretched over oak frames, another construction technique appears to have been in use at the same time in southern Norway. This was a peculiarly Norse invention, with the shell made not of skins, but of very thin wooden planks lashed together by finely drawn sinewy spruce roots. At first, the wooden boat was constructed with no keel, because the added strength provided by a keel was not necessary when the ship was merely being rowed through the comparatively sheltered waterways and fjords on the vast lakes, or through the endless archipelagos of Sweden, Denmark, and Norway. This lightweight craft could be beached easily, and she could be taken far up shallow rivers. Because of her high stem and stern, she could also venture out through surf and across broad bodies of water such as the Baltic or the Skagerrak during the better summer months. But for hundreds of years, she could go no farther. The Northmen had not yet devised sails, and about 2 days was as long as the weather was likely to remain calm enough for rowing. The prototype of the longship exhibited numerous other shortcomings. She was too narrow, which gave her a precarious roll. The sides were not high enough to give her sufficient freeboard for heavy North Atlantic swells. Without a keel, she was difficult to control if there was any adverse current or wind, and even the best oarsmen would quickly become exhausted trying to keep the ship from broaching in a storm. Thus, until the advent of the traditional Viking age, this ingenious vessel remained an effective weapon for local blood feuds and a vehicle for coastal trade, but for nothing more. It was only during the 7th century that the Norsemen learned how to build and sail a longship. To take the finely hewn, neatly wrought prototype, incorporate a keel to add directional stability and thrust, step a sturdy mast, raise a single full-breasted sail and drive her forward beyond the horizon and into the vast expanse of the unknown ocean. The critical addition was the sail, and how the Vikings acquired it is somewhat of a mystery. The Roman Empire, with its sophisticated square-rigged merchantmen, had collapsed centuries earlier as the Dark Ages fell upon Europe. but it is possible that Scandinavian coastal traders observed crude sailing craft inherited by the Frisians from the Romans, whose empire once abutted on Frisia on the North Sea, or that Norse overland traders reaching the Black Sea admired the rigging of the Arab dhows they observed over there. But the Viking sail was so unusual that it might have well been developed in isolation. For a typical 90-foot longship, the mast measured a stubby 30 feet, short enough to be lowered easily into 2 or 3 crutches fixed amidships, well out of the way during a landing or a fight at sea. The sail, to make up for what it lacked in height, was cut in an enormously wide rectangle, up to 40 or 50 feet across in a typical longship, perhaps more than 70 feet for the Long Serpent. It was hoisted aloft on a main yard, and sometimes was footed to a secondary yard at its base. For efficiency, when running before the wind, the sail would often be spread by 2 whisker poles, spars fitted into sockets, and a pair of blocks, mounted on each bulwark just forward of the mast. When the vessel was sailing across the wind or into it, and Viking longships by all accounts sailed well into the wind, only one of these whisker poles was used. The sails themselves were woven of coarse wool and a double layer to provide strength. Their color was generally red, sometimes solid, sometimes patterned in diamonds, squares, or stripes, the better to announce one's presence to friends. Great power could be obtained from these sails, but when they were wet they became exceedingly heavy, and in storms or in fluky winds they could be difficult to maneuver and actually deadly. Even a strapping Viking chieftain could be knocked from his feet. The Norwegian king Eystein, for one, was toppled off his longship and drowned by a wildly swinging yard from another ship that was sailing alongside. At the same time that the Norsemen began stepping masts and rigging sails, they also began building true oak keels into their ships for extra strength required to take the stresses of ocean travel and the driving force of the mast under sail. The keel was T-shaped. Experience had shown that such a keel cut the water and helped the helmsman maintain an even course throughout contrary seas. Because the Vikings needed to beach their boats and to battle in shallow waters as well as to cross oceans, they kept their keels shallow, but made up for that by extending them from stem to stern. The Vikings also devised a remarkable rudder. A stubby, modified steering oar, it was fixed to the starboard quarter of the craft on a large block of wood, pegged so that the oar would turn as the lever turns on a fulcrum. The helmsman used a tiller bar. Since the Norse word for steering board was stjornbordi, the rudder lent its name to the starboard, or right side of the boat. No longer confined to their own coasts, producing ever larger, beamier, more weatherly longships, their sides planked higher to keep them dry while they heeled across the storm-tossed North Sea, the Norsemen were at last loosed upon the world. The exhilaration and sense of bold accomplishment the Northmen felt on sea was never better described than in the 8th century epic poem Beowulf, when Prince Beowulf of the Scandinavian tribe called Vaerjatus set sail to help a Danish ally, Hrothgar, in his fight against the monster, Grendel. Over the breaking billows with bellying sail, a foamy beak, like a flying bird, the ship sped on till the next day's sun showed sea cliffs shining, towering hills, and stretching headlands. The sea was crossed. The voyage ended, the vessel moored, and the Vader people waded ashore, with clatter of trappings and coats of mail, gave thanks to God that his grace had granted sea paths safe for the ocean journey. Aside from the fact that this narrative was transcribed by a Christian monk in Northumbria, and that the Vikings at the time were still heathens who were not inclined to express gratitude to a Christian god, the phrases resounded with love for the sea, and with the virility and prowess that the Vikings derived from being masters of these incomparable warships. So much were the ships a part of their self-image, that Vikings decorated each longship to display wealth, rank, and power, at once impressing their friends and allies and awing their enemies. When a fleet of longships commanded by King Svein Forkbeard prepared to set sail from Denmark to invade England in 1013, a chronicler fell into Homeric rhapsody over the sight of so many ornately carved and gilded vessels. The account states, "On one side, lions molded in gold were to be seen on the ships. On the other, birds on the tops of their masts indicating by their movements the wind as they blew, or dragons of various kind poured fire from their nostrils. Here there were glittering men of solid gold or silver, nearly comparable to live ones. There, bulls with necks raised high and legs outstretched were fashioned leaping and roaring like live ones. The sides of the ship were not painted with ornate colors, but were covered with gold and silver figures. The royal vessels excelled the others in beauty as much as the king preceded the soldiers in the honor of his proper dignity. Placing their confidence in such a fleet, when the signal was suddenly given, the warriors set out gladly, and, as they had been ordered, placed themselves round about the royal vessel with level prows, some in front and some behind. The blue water might be seen foaming far and wide, and the sunlight, cast back in the gleam of metal, spread a double radiance in the air. However much he loved fighting warships, the Viking lived on the sea for many other reasons as well, and devised vessels to match those needs. When he turned his genius for design and construction from warships to ships for long-distance trade and exploration, and eventually for emigration to the farthest reaches of the ocean, he produced a boat equally extraordinary, stouter and sturdier, designed to brave the worst seas in search of landfalls far beyond any other Westerner's wildest dreams. These were the Hafskip, half meaning ocean, and skip, of course, meaning ship. The Hafskip was built with the same construction methods as the fighting longship, high, curved stem and stern, and Lapstrake planking, but it was only half as long, and the Hafskip was by its very nature more seaworthy. The longship was built as an instrument of combat. Long, narrow, and lined with oars for close-quarter maneuvering, it had little room for cargo. The Hafskip, by contrast, was built to carry dozens of men and women, plus all their belongings and provisions, for a period of weeks or even months at sea. To accommodate these passengers and considerable cargo, the Hafskip was designed to be deep and beamy, with stouter ribs and thicker planks and a higher freeboard to keep waves from washing over the sides in northern ocean storms. Compared with the light and flexible longship, the Hafskip was a heavy displacement vessel. In light airs, the longship was faster because it took a good wind to press a heavily laden Hafskip up to her maximum hull speed. But once out in the violent gales of the North Atlantic, the Hafskip was at home. In towering seas and howling winds, where a longship might be forced beyond the limitations of its design, the Hafskip remained secure, driving through the seas at speeds of 10 knots and more. There were a few oar positions in the bow and stern quarters, but only to stroke in and out of fjords and other narrow anchorages. The foredeck and afterdeck were planked over, and there was a substantial hold amidships. Cargo was piled everywhere and covered with ox hides. Sometimes the ship's boat, a simple rowboat, was carried on board, or sometimes towed behind. These admirable Hafskip were built in two basic forms: the stubby Birdinger, which was a smaller vessel, generally less than 40 feet long, used for coastal trading, and the somewhat larger Knarr, which was about 50 feet in length and about 15 feet in the beam. It was this Knarr that became the great Viking ocean voyager, and the care and maintenance of this stout-hearted vessel preoccupied everyone who was fortunate enough to serve as its master. In the 13th century compendium of Norse lore called The King's Mirror, a father gives his son some advice about the upkeep and proper handling of an ocean-going Knarr. He states, "If you are preparing to carry on trade beyond the seas, and you sail your own ship, have it thoroughly coated with tar in autumn, and if possible, keep it tarred all winter. But if the ship is placed on timbers too late to be coated in the fall, tar it when spring opens, and let it dry thoroughly afterward. Always buy shares in good vessels, or in none at all. Keep your ship attractive, for then capable men will join you, and it will be well manned. Be sure to have your ship ready when summer begins, and do your traveling while the season is best. Keep reliable tackle on shipboard at all times, and never remain out at sea in late autumn, if you can avoid it. Whenever you travel at sea, keep on board 200 or 300 ells of wool. Since an ell then measured over 18 inches, this meant about 300 to 500 feet, of a sort suitable for mending sails, that if it should be necessary, a large number of needles, and a supply of thread and cord. You will always need to carry a supply of nails, both spikes and rivets, of such sizes as your ship demands. Also, good boat hooks and broad axes, gouges and augers, and all such other tools as ship's carpenters make use of. All these things that I have now named you must remember to carry with you on shipboard whenever you sail on a trading vessel, and the ship is your own. The conversation between father and son then turns from maintenance and equipment to questions of prudent seamanship. The son inquires how early in the spring and how late in the fall is it possible to make such a voyage. The father answers, "The seas are not all alike, nor are they of equal extent. Small seas have no great perils, and one may risk crossing them at almost any time, for one has to make sure of fair winds to last a day or two, which is not difficult for when men understand the weather. But where travel is beset with greater perils, whether because the sea is wide and full of dangerous currents, or because the prow points toward the shores where the harbors are rendered insecure by rocks, breakers, shallows, and sandbars, whenever the situation is such, one needs to use great caution, and no one should venture to travel over such waters when the season is late. It seems to me that one should hardly venture overseas later than the beginning of October, for at that time the sea begins to grow very restless, and the tempests always increase in violence as autumn passes and winter approaches. Men may venture out upon almost any sea except the largest as early as the beginning of April, for after the 16th of March, the days lengthen, the sun rises higher, and the nights grow shorter." The author adds some sage advice that the man who is to be a trader will have to brave many perils, sometimes at sea and sometimes in heathen lands, but nearly always among alien peoples, and it must be his constant purpose to act discreetly wherever he happens to be. On the sea he must be alert and fearless. And what of this Long Serpent? What fate befell that great vessel, the epitome of Viking design, the pride of shipwright Thorberg, and the joy of Norway's King Olaf Tryggvason? The record does not tell whether he took her on any oversea raids or ocean voyages. Possibly not, for he may have regarded her as too great a treasure to risk on such ventures. In fact, she seems to have been employed mainly as a royal vessel of state, to carry King Olaf on various ceremonial cruises around Scandinavian waters. And it is an irony of history that this was her role when she finally came to combat, and became a prize in one of many ambushes and sea battles that pitted Viking fleet against Viking fleet throughout the age of the Norsemen. That battle occurred scarcely 2 years after the Long Serpent was built in Trondheim Fjord. Olaf had made many enemies in the course of his long and bloody career, and his foes, Denmark's King Svein, Sweden's King Olaf, and a disaffected Norwegian noble named Erik, brought together their warriors and fleets and plotted to lay a trap for the Norwegian monarch. The conspirators agreed that if they were successful, they would divide the kingdom of Norway among themselves, and whosoever captured the prized Long Serpent could keep her as his own. The Norwegian king was at the time cruising the southern Baltic in the Long Serpent, with a fleet of 11 dragon ships and numerous smaller longships and supply vessels. He had gone to Rogaland in southern Norway to conclude the marriage of a sister to a local jarl, and following that was spending the summer renewing old acquaintances in Vinland on the southern coast of the Baltic. When all was in readiness to carry out the ruse, Olaf's enemies prepared to lure him into their ambush. They dispatched a Viking named Sigvald, the ruler of an island off Vinland, to lead the unwitting Olaf astray. When the Norwegian fleet was ready to set sail for home, Sigvald persuaded Olaf in the Long Serpent to follow him on a devious journey through the unfamiliar waters, convincing King Olaf of his navigational prowess by stating, "For I know where the water is deepest between the islands and in the sounds, and these large ships require the deepest." The shallow draft vessels of King Olaf's fleet, not requiring such deep waters, sailed into the Baltic directly. The Long Serpent and a few escort ships followed Sigvald's vessel into the channel behind Svold Island near Vinland, where the combined enemy fleets waited in ambush. Watching from a hilltop on the island, Erik and the kings of Sweden and Denmark saw the parade of longships approach, and among them was one great ship with a large dragonhead, richly gilded. The Danish king boasted, "That dragon shall carry me this evening high, for I shall steer it." But Earl Eric, in a voice loud enough for many people to overhear, sneered, "If King Olaf had no other vessels except that one, King Svein would never take it from him with the Danish force alone." Indeed, the forces of the Swedish and Danish kings were to prove insufficient, and it was Earl Eric who would seize the initiative in the battle. The ambushers hurried down to their fleet and prepared their warriors for battle, striking tents and gathering weapons and shields. As the Long Serpent neared Svold Island, the enemy fleet came rowing forth to the sound. In great alarm, King Olaf's escort converged on the Long Serpent, begging their ruler to flee if he could, and not risk battle with so great a force. High on the afterdeck, where he stood at the steering oar, King Olaf replied, "Strike the sails. Never shall men of mine think of flight. I never fled from battle. Let God dispose of my life, but flight I shall never take." Olaf's men then ordered all loyal ships to form the usual Viking line of battle, prow to prow, tail to tail, to be lashed together at stem and stern in such a way that they formed a great fortress-like raft. But Olaf's ship was so huge in comparison with those on either side that her prow protruded far beyond the prows of the other ships. This posed a terrible hazard to the King Olaf's leading warriors, who would be fighting in the prow of his dragon ship, and would thus be exposed on both sides. Olaf's greatest prowman, Ulf the Red, grumbled, "We shall have hard work of it here." The Norwegian king was furious at the complaint, and he drew his bow and aimed an arrow at his own prowman. But Ulf responded, "Shoot the other way, king, where it is more needful. My work is your gain." From the enemy fleet, King Svein was the first to reach the Long Serpent's prow, but he suffered tremendous losses when he attempted to board. Then came the Swedish king, and he too was beaten off and sustained frightful casualties. But Earl Eric was not to be thwarted. Attacking the flank with many ships, he worked his deadly way down the line of defenders, hewing and hacking each vessel clear of her warriors, and then cutting her loose from the rest. Outnumbered and weakened, King Olaf's men began to panic. They clambered from their smaller ships to the bigger ones at the center of the line, their numbers growing fewer and fewer as they retreated before the attackers, until at last all the survivors were gathered aboard the Long Serpent herself. The Norse poet Halldor described the carnage. "Sharp was the clang of shield and sword, and shrill the song of spears on board, and whistling arrows thickly flew against the Serpent's gallant crew. And still fresh foemen, it is said, Earl Eric to her long side led, whole armies of his Danes and Swedes, wielding on high their blue sword blades. Hard pressed on every side by foes, the Serpent reels beneath the blows. Crash go the shields around the bow, breastplates and breasts pierced through and through." Surrounded and now doomed, Olaf and his men stood behind their shields as a hail of missiles from the enemy ships crashed down around them. When at last Eric pulled alongside the Long Serpent, Einar Thrombelskilfer, another of Olaf's brave men, drew himself up by the Long Serpent's mast and tried to get a clear shot with his bow and arrow at Eric. Einar's arrow hit the tiller above Eric's head so hard, recounts the saga, that it drove into the wood up the length of its shaft. Einar drew his bow again, but an arrow from Eric's ship hit his bow and split it in two. Olaf threw Einar another bow, but Einar spurned it, saying it was too weak for the bow of a mighty king, and he fought on instead with sword and shield. King Olaf, who was hurling spears at the enemy, noticed his men were landing many blows with their swords, but seldom making a fatal wound. They called to him that their swords were blunt after hours of battle. Olaf opened a chest and passed out new, sharper swords, but as he did, his men saw blood running down his arms under his steel gloves. He was wounded, but they could not tell where and dared not to ask. Aboard the Long Serpent, the toughest men were fighting in the bow and the stern, where the ship was the highest. In the center, Olaf's men were thinned by slaughter. Using this gap, Eric's Vikings stormed the Long Serpent. At last, there was only a small band of defenders gathered around King Olaf in the stern of his great ship. The deck was wet with blood. More and more, Eric's men climbed aboard and closed on the stern, hacking with broadaxes and swords. When Olaf and his remaining men saw that the battle was lost, they leaped into the sea with their armor, shields, and weapons. The enemy tried to seize the king before he sank, but he pulled his shield over his head and vanished beneath the waters. The Long Serpent became Eric's booty, along with his share of Norway. Under Eric, she was for many years a symbol of Viking prowess. 200 years later, in the 13th century, when the chronicler Snorri Sturluson recorded King Olaf's saga, the Long Serpent's oaken bones were still visible beside Trondheim Fjord, a reminder of the greatness of the Viking mariner and the boldness of the Viking warrior.